Welcome to the world of whispered history, where we unravel the quiet moments within grand events. Tonight, we step into the mud-caked boots of a young British sapper on the Western Front, 1916. Settle in wherever you are and allow yourself to drift. Find that comfortable spot, perhaps a soft chair or even a well-worn cushion, and let your shoulders relax. Imagine the evening drawing in, or maybe the bright morning sun is just peeking over the horizon in your part of the world. Wherever your day finds you, and whatever delightful chaos it holds. If you find yourself enjoying these journeys back in time, consider joining our circle of listeners by hitting that subscribe button. It helps us keep these stories alive. Now, picture this, a constant drumming rhythm, not of rain, but of the earth itself groaning under the weight of unseen forces. You are in a trench, a narrow slit in the world, and your job, your crucial, life-saving job, is to keep the voices alive. The wires, your lifeline, are fragile threads in this storm, and you, a sapper, are their guardian. The constant thud of artillery is your lullaby, a grim reminder that the world outside this damp, confined space is in constant turmoil. And every foot of cable you mend is a victory, a whisper of hope against the roar. The familiar jolt of artillery fire shuddered through the packed earth beneath my boots. It was early 1916, and the landscape around Ypres had been reshaped by countless explosions into a churned, muddy wound. My name is Thomas, and while others carried rifles and bayonets, my tools were wire cutters, splicers, and an almost instinctual understanding of how electricity flowed. I was a sapper, tasked with maintaining the arteries of our communication, the telephone wires that pulsed with orders and reports, the unseen veins carrying the lifeblood of our army. My civilian work as an apprentice electrician had prepared me for intricate wiring and delicate connections, skills I now applied in the grim theater of war, where a severed line could mean isolation and disaster for my company. Sergeant Davies, a man whose face seemed etched by the very trenches we inhabited, nodded towards a section of cable that lay exposed near a freshly gouged crater. Thomas, that line's gone dead again. Fritz seems to have a knack for finding our weak spots. The sharp crack of rifle fire, a sound as constant as our breathing, punctuated his words. A faint smell of damp earth mingled with the pungent sting of cordite that burned my throat always lingered in the air here. This was a routine repair, or so it seemed, but the unpredictable intensity of the barrage quickly turned it into a tense affair, making every movement a calculation against the earth's violent trembling. I knelt beside the mangled wire, my gloved fingers tracing the break. It was a clean snap, the insulation peeled back as if by a giant unseen hand. My mind sifted through lessons learned about gutta percha, the insulating material used in these early telegraph wires, and its susceptibility to the extreme temperatures from nearby shell bursts. The sheer scale of the network, a vast, complex spiderweb of connections stretching across the desolate expanse of no man's land, never failed to impress me with its vital importance, a fragile thread holding the chaos together. With practiced efficiency, I selected my wire cutters and splicers. The work demanded a precise, steady hand, even as the ground vibrated with each artillery impact. I explained to a younger recruit, barely more than a boy, the concept of continuity testing, ensuring there were no breaks or shorts in the circuit. "We need a clear path for every message," I told him, my voice low to cut through the distant din. My expertise wasn't about earning medals. It was about the practical, life-saving function of keeping these lines alive, ensuring that critical information flowed unimpeded. The weight of responsibility settled upon me with the familiarity of my heavy pack. A successful repair meant a vital message could reach command, potentially allowing them to call off a planned disastrous counterattack. Conversely, a failure on my part could mean my comrades were sent charging into an unseen ambush, unprepared for what awaited them. The thought of that possibility, of men falling because a single strand of wire wasn't properly joined, pressed down on me, a constant, heavy burden. This effort to mend a simple wire line served as a stark reminder of the critical, often unseen role communication played in the early days of this mechanized war. Unlike the roar of cannons or the flash of rifles, our work was quiet, often performed under the constant threat of artillery, and required a sheer grit that few outside our small group truly understood. The vulnerability of these lines to even the slightest bombardment was a constant concern, and keeping them functional demanded an almost relentless perseverance. As I finished the splice, testing the connection with a small hand-cranked generator, a faint buzz confirmed the circuit was complete. My initial anxieties about the escalating barrage began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. While the raw, visceral experience of the near misses and the ever-present threat of danger had certainly left its mark, successfully executing a critical task like this tempered my fears, fostering a nascent belief in my own resilience and the importance of my role. Following that repair, Sergeant Davies assigned me a new task, reinforcing a section of cable that ran perilously close to a field of shell craters. The damp, clinging conditions made the work particularly treacherous, the mud itself seeming to cling to everything, reducing visibility and making the delicate cables difficult to locate and handle. The unhealthy air, heavy with the stagnant smell of water and decay, made each breath a conscious, labored effort. I found myself wiping sweat from my brow and shielding my eyes from the gritty dirt that seemed to coat every surface, a constant discomfort that only added to the challenge. The persistent vibration from distant artillery fire made my delicate work even more precarious, as if the very ground were trying to shake loose the connections I struggled to secure. Examining the exposed cable, I could see how prolonged submersion in this perpetually sodden environment had begun to degrade the rubber insulation. This brought to mind my lessons on the properties of early rubber compounds, how they were susceptible to moisture and slow deterioration. A grim parallel to the human bodies I had seen half buried in the muck, stark reminders of the cost of even minor failures in this war. This awareness of the element's impact fueled my determination to find a more robust solution. I recalled a technique I had discussed with Sergeant Davies, an idea born from necessity. We would use a specially prepared tarred cloth, carefully wrapping and sealing each exposed wire junction to prevent any moisture from seeping in, a practical innovation aimed at counteracting the relentless damp. This process involved a painstaking application, ensuring a tight, impermeable seal against the pervasive wetness that characterized our existence here. The personal stakes of this particular repair were significant. If these vital communication lines failed, the crucial artillery support for our left flank would be silenced, leaving the men stationed there horribly exposed to any enemy advance. My reputation as a sapper, built on a foundation of reliable work, was also on the line. A poorly executed repair could lead to a severe reprimand, or worse, depending on the ultimate consequences of such a failure. The thought of being responsible for leaving men vulnerable spurred me to work with even greater care and focus. This constant battle against both the enemy and the overwhelming environmental challenges was a defining characteristic of our existence on the Western Front. Soldiers, like myself, had to constantly adapt and improvise, finding new ways to maintain essential infrastructure in the face of conditions that were as formidable as any opposing army. The ingenuity required to keep the delicate threads of communication intact, often through sheer perseverance and practical adaptation, was a testament to the resilience of the men who served. Successfully applying our improvised re-insulation technique to the vulnerable cable section instilled a quiet sense of pride and competence. I began to grasp, in a way I hadn't before, that my individual ingenuity and meticulous attention to detail could make a tangible difference in the face of overwhelming odds. This fostered a nascent belief in my own resilience, a quiet confidence that emerged from successfully overcoming the practical, everyday challenges of maintaining our vital lifelines in this unforgiving landscape. A few days later, a new mission emerged from the fragmented whispers of intercepted enemy messages. A partially garbled transmission suggested a possible flanking maneuver by the opposing forces, making the secure relay of our own intelligence absolutely paramount. My task was to ensure our communications remained uninterrupted, even under the harsh conditions of heavy enemy fire, by extending a secondary line to a forward observation post that had recently been established. While carefully laying the new cable, an unexpected burst of machine gun fire erupted nearby, forcing me to dive for cover behind a mound of sandbags. The chilling whistle of incoming mortar rounds was a sharp prelude to the deafening roar of shells exploding uncomfortably close. The bitterness of the weak tea from my canteen, a small comfort I had brought along, did little to offset the gnawing fear that accompanied such close calls, and I found myself tasting the metal of my rifle stock as I tried to steady my breathing. As I resumed my work, I examined the faint signals being picked up by my specialized equipment, noting the distinctive interference patterns that marred the clarity of the transmission. My mind turned to the principles of signal amplification and the severe limitations of the early radio technology then in use, which only underscored the indispensable role these physical wires played in ensuring reliable communication across the battlefield. The intricate network of communication lines, usually hidden from view, was now a starkly vital necessity for our survival. With careful, practiced movements, I began to splice the new cable into the existing network, ensuring each connection was clean and secure, free from any potential sources of disruption. My knowledge of signal degradation, how the strength of a message could weaken over distance or through faulty connections, guided me in selecting the optimal routing, a path that deliberately avoided areas known for their exceptionally heavy shelling. My steady hands, a testament to my rigorous training, were crucial in this delicate operation. The personal stakes involved in this particular task were immediate and significant. If the secondary line I was extending failed to become operational, crucial battlefield intelligence might not reach headquarters in time to inform their decisions, directly imperiling the lives of my entire battalion. My own survival, I knew, was inextricably linked to the success of this mission. A single error on my part could have devastating repercussions for all of us. This task of extending a new communication line amidst sporadic enemy fire offered a profound insight into the critical importance of intelligence gathering and its rapid dissemination during the brutal realities of trench warfare. It highlighted the constant, inherent risk associated with even the most basic logistical operations, where the simple act of laying a wire could become a life-or-death gamble against an unseen enemy. The experience was a potent reminder of the constant danger that lurked just beyond the familiar confines of our trenches. The close call with the machine gun fire had certainly shaken me, a visceral reminder of my own mortality. But the successful establishment of the new communication line reinforced my resolve. I was learning to compartmentalize the ever-present fear, to focus with unwavering intensity on the task at hand, a vital step in my personal development as a soldier and as a man. This ability to act despite my fear, to push forward when every instinct screamed for retreat, was proving to be as important as any technical skill I possessed. A peculiar problem arose a few days later. Strange interference was disrupting our outgoing messages, creating phantom signals that were causing confusion within our command structure. My new mission was to meticulously locate the source of this interference, which could stem from an enemy jamming device or, perhaps more worryingly, a critical fault within our own complex network of wires, a potential internal failure that was harder to diagnose. I began to move cautiously through the labyrinthine trenches, their claustrophobic confines making me feel even more exposed and vulnerable to the unseen threats that lurked nearby. The overflowing latrines and the scuffling of rats, their tiny claws scratching against the damp earth, were a constant, unpleasant reminder of our harsh living conditions. The pervasive tension that permeated everything made each breath require effort, a deliberate act to draw enough air into my lungs. Using specialized equipment that measured electrical signals, I started to triangulate the source of the interference, my mind working through the principles of electromagnetic waves and the rudimentary radio technology then being deployed by both sides. The sheer complexity of identifying a subtle fault amidst the countless miles of wire that crisscrossed the battlefield, presented a daunting intellectual challenge, a puzzle that required absolute concentration and a deep understanding of electrical circuits. My expertise in signal analysis soon led me to suspect a damaged relay station located further up the line, a potential weak point in our otherwise robust network. I meticulously tested each section of cable, relying on my understanding of electrical circuits to isolate the problem, systematically eliminating potential causes as I moved along the wire. Each connection checked, each reading taken, was a step closer to uncovering the source of this vexing disruption, and I felt the familiar focus of problem solving begin to sharpen my senses. The personal stakes associated with this particular problem were significant. If the interference persisted, vital operational orders could be misinterpreted by our forward units, potentially leading to disastrous tactical blunders that could cost many lives. My career as a sapper, my ability to contribute effectively to the war effort, depended on my skill in solving these complex technical problems under immense duress, and I was determined to succeed. This intellectual challenge, so distinct from the direct physical danger of the battlefield, provided a different kind of stress, one that engaged my mind rather than my body. Successfully solving the puzzle of the phantom signal brought a unique satisfaction, a quiet sense of accomplishment that momentarily pushed back the ever-present existential dread that haunted us. It was a brief respite from the constant threat of physical harm, a chance to engage my brain in a way that felt almost like a return to my old life. My final mission, or at least the next step in the unfolding conflict, was to lay a new, heavily reinforced communication line. This crucial task was planned to occur under the absolute cover of darkness, a necessary precaution to coordinate a major offensive that was scheduled to begin with the first light of dawn. It required venturing into the terrifying, desolate expanse of no man's land, a place where the familiar sounds of war took on a more menacing tone. The night was alive with a harsh mix of sounds. The deep rumble of artillery fire and the sharp staccato bursts of small arms fire echoed across the devastated landscape. The ground beneath my feet was slick with mud, and visibility was almost nil, reducing the world to a few feet around me, illuminated by the weak glow of distant flares. The chilling whistle of incoming shells was a constant, unnerving companion, and each cautious step I took was a gamble against the unseen dangers that lurked in the darkness. The raw fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but the memory of fallen comrades, their faces etched in my mind, pushed me forward with a grim determination. Navigating this desolate terrain was a testament to my intimate knowledge of the trench system and the scarred earth. I guided myself by the faint glow of distant flares and the feel of the ground beneath my boots, recognizing the remnants of shattered barbed wire and the somber shapes of fallen comrades. The sheer tenacity required to build and maintain this essential network of communication, often under the most extreme conditions, became profoundly clear to me in that moment, a realization that deepened my respect for the work we did. With extreme care, I began to unspool the new, heavily insulated cable, anchoring it securely at intervals to prevent it from being dislodged by the unstable ground or the ever-present tremors. My knowledge of knots and load-bearing materials, skills honed through countless hours of practice, was essential for laying the cable without snapping it under the slightest strain or snagging it on the jagged debris scattered across the battlefield. The slightest mistake could have catastrophic consequences. The personal stakes of this mission were immense, as the success of the entire offensive hinged on this single communication line remaining intact and functional. If it failed, our forces would advance into the enemy lines effectively blind, with potentially devastating consequences for thousands of men, including myself and the other sappers who depended on my work. The weight of this immense responsibility pressed down on me, a palpable force that seemed to make the cable itself feel heavier in my hands. This task represented the ultimate test of my abilities and my resolve. The psychological toll of the war had been immense, and the constant, gnawing fear had been a heavy, unrelenting burden. However, by successfully completing this mission, venturing into the heart of danger, and ensuring the vital flow of information, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and a deeper understanding of my own capacity for resilience and courage. The experience had irrevocably changed me, hardening me against the constant threats, but also solidifying my belief in the critical importance of my role in this vast, unfolding conflict. The long night had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp.
The damp chill of the trench seemed to seep into my bones, a more persistent enemy than any bullet. Following the successful reinforcement of the forward line, my attention now turned to a different, yet equally vital task. A crucial sector of cable laid across a field pocked with the recent scars of shell craters needed strengthening before an impending push. This work was doubly difficult because the ground itself remained sodden, a constant, clinging mire that threatened to swallow anything left unsecured. My responsibility to ensure reliable communication for the planned advance felt heavier than ever, a silent burden I carried alongside my tools. The earth vibrated with the distant rhythmic thud of artillery, a sound that never truly ceased and made delicate work almost impossible. Worse still, the communication cables themselves were submerged in thick, clinging mud, rendering them obscure and treacherous to handle. The unhealthy air, thick with the pervasive smells of stagnant water and the faint tang of decay, made each breath a conscious effort. I found myself wiping sweat from my brow more often than usual and shielding my eyes from the gritty dirt kicked up by passing lorries. This persistent dampness, I knew, was a relentless foe to the delicate copper wires and their rubber insulation. As I began to trace the buried lines, I examined the telltale signs of prolonged submersion on the cable's protective casing. My mind went back to my civilian apprenticeships, where we learned about the early rubber compounds used for insulation. These materials, while a marvel of their time, were terribly susceptible to moisture and gradual degradation, a fact starkly emphasized by the mangled bodies I sometimes saw half buried in the muck nearby,
a grim testament to the cost of even minor failures in our efforts. This made my current task not just about maintaining a connection, but about preserving the very sinews of our command structure. It was then that Sergeant Davies and I had devised a new method, a small innovation born from sheer necessity. I began employing this technique now, re-insulating exposed wires using a specially prepared tarred cloth. This involved careful overlapping wrapping and then sealing the seams to prevent any moisture ingress, a practical solution to a persistent problem. The material itself was rough to the touch, but when applied correctly, it offered a much more robust barrier against the relentless damp than the original failing insulation.
The stakes felt considerable. If these cables, weakened by the constant damp and vibration, were to fail, the artillery support for our exposed flank would be silenced. This would leave our men terribly vulnerable, and my reputation as a sapper, built on careful work and reliability, would be in jeopardy. A poor repair could lead to severe reprimand, or worse, depending on the catastrophic consequences that might follow such a breakdown in communication. My skill, it seemed, was constantly being tested by both the enemy and the very earth beneath us. This constant battle against the elements, as much as against the enemy's guns, was a fundamental truth of this war. Soldiers like myself had to adapt and improvise to maintain the essential infrastructure of communication amidst overwhelming environmental challenges. We relied on ingenuity and sheer grit, often turning everyday materials into vital tools for survival and success. The success of a military operation could hinge on something as seemingly mundane as a well-insulated wire, a fact that made my work feel both profoundly important and terrifyingly precarious. The successful application of our improvised repair technique, the tarred cloth holding firm against the damp, instilled a welcome sense of pride and competence within me. I began to truly understand, on a visceral level, that my individual ingenuity could make a tangible difference in the chaos of this war. This understanding fostered a nascent belief in my own resilience, a quiet confidence that grew with each small victory against the overwhelming forces that sought to isolate and defeat us. This encounter with the relentless mud and the machines of war lingered in my thoughts. A faint whisper, a garbled enemy message, had arrived earlier that day, suggesting they might try to flank us on the western sector. Sergeant Davies had nodded grimly, his gaze fixed on the trench map, and then he turned to me. "Thomas," he'd said, his voice low, "we need eyes on that rise near the old farmhouse. Needs a secondary line, quick and steady, right to the observation post there." My task, therefore, was clear. Get a new cable laid, ensuring our own intelligence could flow without a hitch, no matter what the enemy decided to throw at us. As I started unspooling the thick, insulated wire, the ground began to shudder. The distant, rhythmic thump of artillery, a sound I'd grown far too accustomed to, suddenly became a frantic, irregular pounding. Each impact sending tremors through the earth beneath my boots. The sharp staccato crack of rifle fire joined the din, a constant, unnerving accompaniment that made me flinch even when nothing seemed near. This familiar stench of churned mud,
Something akin to damp rot and gunpowder stung my throat, a stark reminder of where I was. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of splicing, moved with practiced speed, but the very act of laying the cable felt like a gamble. I found myself constantly wiping sweat from my brow, the grime sticking to my skin, and shielding my eyes against the grit kicked up by the concussions. The whistle of incoming mortar rounds sliced through the air, a chilling prelude to the deafening roar of shells exploding nearby, and I could taste the bitter tea from my canteen, a small, familiar comfort in the face of such overwhelming chaos. This particular section of the battlefield was a graveyard of shattered barbed wire and churned earth, each new step a potential hazard. I remembered the principles of signal amplification I'd learned, and how even the most robust early radio technology was still prone to interference, making these tangible physical wires not just useful, but utterly crucial. The intricate network of communication lines, usually hidden away, became a raw, exposed lifeline in these moments, its integrity meaning the difference between life and death. I had to analyze the faint, almost imperceptible signals my equipment was picking up, noting the patterns of interference that seemed to dance across the channels. My mind sifted through countless details about early wireless systems and their limitations, confirming that these physical connections were indeed the backbone of our operations. The vast, unseen web of wires stretching across the battlefield, a marvel of its own kind, now felt more vital than ever. My practiced hands, steady despite the trembling earth, began the delicate work of splicing the new cable. I ensured each connection was clean and secure, using the tools Sergeant Davies had entrusted to me. My knowledge of how signals degrade over distance and through various materials allowed me to select the most sensible routing, steering clear of areas known for particularly heavy shelling, a calculated decision to minimize risk. The immediate personal stake was clear. If this secondary line failed, the vital battlefield intelligence we were trying to relay might not reach headquarters in time. This could directly imperil the lives of my battalion, leaving them vulnerable to any flanking maneuver the enemy might attempt. My own survival, I knew, was intrinsically linked to the success of this mission, a heavy burden that settled on my shoulders. It was during this painstaking work that a sudden, sharp burst of machine gun fire ripped through the air, forcing me to drop flat into the muddy trench. The metallic clatter was terrifyingly close, and for a heart-stopping moment, I felt utterly exposed. This wasn't the distant rumble of artillery. This was immediate, personal danger, and I could feel my own pulse hammering against my ribs. Diving for cover, I felt the impact of the billets kicking up dirt mere inches from where my head had been. The whistle of incoming mortar rounds was a chilling sound, a stark warning of the deafening roar of shells that would surely follow. I took a shaky breath, tasting the bitter tea still on my tongue, a small, familiar comfort against the raw fear. It was moments like these where the abstract concept of war became brutally, terrifyingly personal that tested a man's resolve. My mind, however, had to push past the immediate terror. I recalled the principles of signal amplification and how the limitations of early radio technology made these physical wires even more crucial. The intricate network of communication lines across the battlefield, usually hidden from view, was now a starkly visible life or death necessity, and its continued function was my sole concern. With a surge of adrenaline, I resumed my task, my fingers finding the break in the existing line. I expertly spliced the new cable, ensuring the connections were clean and secure, a testament to the countless hours I'd spent honing this skill. My knowledge of signal degradation informed my choice of the optimal routing, guiding me away from areas known for heavy shelling. It was a small victory, but in this landscape of destruction, any victory felt significant. The close call with the machine gun fire had shaken me to my core. Yet the successful establishment of the new line brought a surge of relief and a reinforcing of my resolve. I found myself learning to compartmentalize the fear, to push it aside and focus solely on the task at hand, a vital step in my personal development. This ability to function amidst chaos, to maintain composure when my body screamed for flight, was becoming a crucial part of my survival. I had witnessed the effectiveness of a well-placed burst of machine gun fire and understood, perhaps more intimately than ever, the constant risk associated with even the most basic logistical operations. The chatter from the observation post, now a clear, steady stream of information, was a quiet testament to the importance of my work. It was a satisfaction that went beyond mere duty. It was the quiet pride of knowing I had helped keep our men safe. I had felt a profound sense of purpose as I secured the final connection, a feeling that would stay with me. The distinctive, faintly sweet scent of almonds reached me even before the sharp, urgent blast of the gas alarm horn. It was a smell that promised choking, burning misery, a horror I had only heard whispered about until that moment. The enemy's artillery, which had been a constant, dull thunder for days, now intensified, each deafening roar punctuated by the sharp crackle of machine gun fire. Across the trench, I saw men scrambling, fumbling with the canvas bags that held their respirators, their movements frantic. I felt a prickle of sweat trickle down my temple, and I quickly reached for my own mask, the rubber cool and oddly comforting against my skin. As the first wisps of the greenish-yellow cloud began to snake along the parapet, I knew my task was not just about making repairs, but about protecting the very means of our communication from this new, insidious threat. The fragile network of wires, usually buried or hidden, felt incredibly exposed. I had to ensure those lines remained intact, carrying the vital warnings and orders that could mean the difference between life and death. This responsibility felt heavier than the waterlogged greatcoat I wore. I observed how the gas cloud, a visible manifestation of unseen danger, clung to the damp earth and the wooden revetments of the trench. It settled into the dips and hollows, a tangible enemy. My mind raced, recalling lessons from the signal depot,
thinking about the rubber insulation that sheathed the delicate copper strands. I wondered how these compounds, designed for durability in mud and rain, would react to the chemical agents now drifting towards us. The fragility of our technological lifeline was starkly revealed in that moment. A spider web of copper, vulnerable to even the slightest tear in its protective skin. My attention turned to the junctions, the places where cables were joined or connected to equipment. These were the most likely points of failure, and I moved with a practiced urgency, my fingers working with a speed born of necessity. I had rolls of thick canvas treated with a waterproofing agent, and I began to wrap the exposed connections, drawing the material taut and securing it with lengths of stout twine. My expertise in electrical insulation was now being tested against a chemical threat, a battle fought with tape and fabric against a poisonous fog. Each movement was deliberate, a calculated risk taken in the swirling, acrid air. A break in communications during a gas attack would be catastrophic. Confused orders, delayed reinforcements, the inability to coordinate our defenses, any of these could lead to widespread casualties. My duty to keep these wires alive was a direct imperative to protect the men in my company, and I felt the full weight of that responsibility pressing down, making each breath through my respirator a conscious effort. It was a grim realization, seeing how chemical warfare added yet another layer of terror and technical challenge to the already immense task of maintaining the essential infrastructure of this war. We fought not only the enemy's bullets and shells, but also the very elements, and now a venomous fog that could choke the life out of everything, including the silent carriers of our messages. The terror of the gas attack was profound, a visceral fear that threatened to paralyze me. Yet, as I worked, securing each connection, the sheer necessity of the task pushed me forward. My ability to act, despite the gnawing fear, marked a significant turning point, I felt. I was no longer just a technician. I was a protector, a vital link in the chain that kept our comrades safe. The psychological toll, however, was beginning to manifest as a persistent knot of unease, a quiet hum of dread beneath the surface of my resolve. My sapper's tools felt familiar in my hands as I worked. The whistle of an incoming shell shrieked, a sound I knew too well, a sound that never truly left you. This one landed with a jarring thud, sending tremors through the earth and shaking loose clods of mud from the trench walls. It had been a few days since the gas attack, and though the air was clearer, a constant damp chill remained, clinging to everything like the ubiquitous mud itself. My mission today was to repair a critical communication line that had gone dead, a line that carried the signals for vital artillery adjustments. The last attempt at coordinating our gunners had resulted in a truly botched barrage, and the thought of friendly fire, of our own men being caught in the crossfire because of a broken wire, was a heavy burden. I had to restore that connection, and quickly. The ground around the suspected break was a churned mess, evidence of the relentless shelling. Navigating the treacherous landscape where every step could mean sinking into a hidden puddle or dislodging something unstable, was disorienting. The constant tremor of the earth beneath my feet made it difficult to keep my balance, and I found myself instinctively ducking and tensing even when no immediate threat seemed apparent. The whistle of incoming rounds, that chilling prelude to the deafening roar of explosions, was a constant companion, a morbid serenade. I took a bite of a stale biscuit, the dry, chalky taste a stark contrast to the acrid smell of cordite that perpetually hung in the air, a smell that burned my throat when I breathed too deeply. Following the presumed path of the severed cable, my fingers, toughened by constant work, brushed against the damp, cold earth. Nearby, a fresh crater gaped, its edges still raw and steaming slightly from the recent blast. It was there, nestled in the churned mud, that I found the break. The cable lay exposed, its insulation completely vaporized where the concussive force of the explosion had been most intense, leaving only a few frayed strands of wire. The extreme temperatures generated by such a blast were astonishing. It was a stark reminder of the crude yet powerful nature of the weapons used here, and the equally crude materials we often had to rely on for repairs, like the rough insulating tape that was our current salvation. My task was clear, but far from simple. Create a new splice using scavenged wire and what little insulating tape we had left. It was a painstaking process, made all the more difficult by the conditions. Each movement had to be precise, deliberate, almost surgical. My knowledge of electrical conductivity was paramount. Even a small imperfection, a tiny nick in the insulation, or a poorly twisted connection could render the line useless again, or worse, cause a short that might cascade through other parts of the network. The fragility of our communication system, this spider web of unseen veins, felt more apparent than ever in that moment, and the weight of keeping it alive was immense. The consequences of this failure were not just personal, not just about my reputation as a sapper. The lack of communication had already led to a botched artillery barrage, a terrible and avoidable miscalculation. If I couldn't restore this line quickly, our own troops, those lads I shared rations with and heard singing on better days, could now be at risk from friendly fire, from our own guns turning on them. The thought of my comrades being harmed, their lives put in peril due to my inaction, my failure to make this connection secure, was a chilling prospect that spurred me on, pushing away the gnawing fear. It's a grim business, this war, and maintaining these wires is a constant battle against more than just the enemy. We fought the mud, the water, the sheer destructive force of artillery, and sometimes the very materials we used. For instance, a mainstream historical fact is that many early communication cables used a form of gutta-percha, a natural rubber for insulation. However, this material, while effective, could degrade in prolonged exposure to dampness and fluctuating temperatures, making our repairs even more critical. One quirky detail I'd learned was that some sappers would sometimes use waxed paper or even treated cloth in a pinch, though the reliability was always suspect. A quirky scholarly debate that persisted even then was over the best methods for waterproofing cable joints to prevent corrosion,
a problem that never truly seemed to have a perfect solution out here. As I worked, a strange sort of calm settled over me, a focus born of necessity. I found myself lost in the task, the rhythmic twist of the wire, the careful wrapping of the tape, a familiar dance. My fingers, though numb from the cold, worked with a practiced efficiency. I knew the signals were important, that a successful artillery adjustment could make all the difference in an assault, turning a potential disaster into a coordinated advance. My own survival and that of the men around me was inextricably linked to the reliability of this fragile thread. The thought of my mates waiting for word, for the whistle of our own artillery to signal their advance, kept my hands steady. Meanwhile, the general chaos of the battlefield continued around me, a muted roar in the background, punctuated by the sharper crack of rifle fire closer by. I tried to block it out, to concentrate on the fine work before me. My eyes scanned the newly laid section of wire, ensuring no kinks or exposed strands marred its surface. This was my domain, my responsibility, the quiet, often unseen contribution to the larger struggle. It was a world away from the bayonet charges and the roar of the guns, yet perhaps more critical in its own way. Building on the necessity of secure connections, I realized the stark contrast between the vital messages carried by these wires and the often rudimentary nature of their protection. The sheer destructive power unleashed by even a single shell could obliterate sections of our lifeline, forcing constant, dangerous repairs. This process demanded an almost obsessive attention to detail, a characteristic I'd developed in my pre-war days working in the telegraph office, a skill that now felt amplified tenfold in its importance. Each successful splice was a small victory against the overwhelming forces arrayed against us. My focus narrowed to the immediate task at hand, completing the splice. I made sure the connections were tight, the tape wrapped snugly, creating a barrier against the damp earth and the ever-present grime. The thought of what might happen if this repair failed, if those adjustments never reached the batteries, was a heavy one. It wasn't just about my duty, it was about the lives of the men who would be depending on those accurate calculations, the men advancing into the unknown based on information that flowed through this very wire. As I finished the last wrap of tape, I tested the line, my specialized equipment humming softly. The needle on the galvanometer flickered, then settled, indicating a clear, unbroken circuit. A surge of relief, sharp and potent, coursed through me. I had done it. The connection was re-established. The vital signals could once again flow. The knowledge that I had averted potential disaster, that our boys would now have the correct artillery support, felt both heavy and precious. A strange crackle had begun to mar the crispness of our outgoing messages, like static on a phantom radio, creating these confusing ghost signals that would twist our command's orders into nonsense. My own duty, therefore, was to track down the root of this interference, a task that felt like chasing shadows in the war's pervasive gloom. For the source might be anything from a deliberate enemy jamming device to a hidden, critical fault deep within our own sprawling network of wires. This was not the usual mud and shell damage, but something far more insidious, a subtle disruption that could undo all our hard-won progress. Moving through the communication trenches felt different this time. The usual urgency was layered with a new kind of caution, as the claustrophobic confines seemed to press in on me even more than usual. The constant, unpleasant reminders of our surroundings, the overflowing latrines and the scurrying of rats that darted just at the edge of vision, did little to ease the mounting tension that made each breath feel like a deliberate effort, a conscious act against the unhealthy air. I found myself constantly wiping my brow, not from heat, but from the sheer strain of concentration and the unsettling feeling of being watched.
Using the portable diagnostic gear Sergeant Davies had managed to procure, a bulky set of sensitive meters and coils that felt both archaic and miraculous, I began the painstaking process of triangulating the source of this phantom signal. My mind, trained in the principles of electrical circuits and the nascent understanding of electromagnetic waves, wrestled with the sheer complexity of identifying a subtle fault amidst the countless miles of wire that webbed the battlefield, each strand a potential culprit. The very air seemed to hum with unseen disturbances, and distinguishing the genuine from the false was a constant battle of senses. My experience and careful analysis began to point towards a damaged relay station, a junction box further up the line that had been bypassed during a previous skirmish, and I meticulously started testing each section of cable leading to it, relying on my deep understanding of electrical circuits to isolate the problem. Each connection had to be checked, each splice examined, and with every successful test, the suspected location narrowed, bringing me closer to the heart of the disruption, though the journey was fraught with its own quiet perils. The method required an immense amount of patience. The personal stakes felt higher than ever. If this interference persisted, vital operational orders, carefully crafted and relayed through our fragile system, could be misinterpreted, leading to disastrous tactical blunders that would cost lives. My own career as a sapper, built on reliability and precision, depended on my ability to solve these complex technical problems under duress, proving my worth not just with a shovel and wire cutters, but with a keen mind. A mistake here could mean not just reprimand, but the unraveling of careful plans and the exposure of our men. This particular challenge, the unraveling of a phantom signal, stood apart from the direct physical danger I usually faced, presenting a different kind of stress, a purely intellectual battleground where the enemy was a glitch in the system. The process of diagnosing and solving such a complex fault brought a unique kind of satisfaction, a quiet triumph that boosted my confidence in my problem-solving abilities, offering a brief, welcome respite from the constant, gnawing existential dread that permeated life in the trenches. It was a reminder that my mind, too, was a weapon. The sheer number of connections and the variety of components, each a potential weak point, made pinpointing the exact location of the disturbance a monumental task. I had to consider how even a slight fraying of insulation,
A tiny imperfection in a solder joint, or even a stray bit of metallic debris could create a pathway for these erroneous signals to bleed into our primary lines. The rudimentary nature of much of our equipment meant that perfection was a luxury we rarely afforded, and yet reliability was everything. Moving from one communication dugout to the next, I listened intently to the faint whispers and crackles from my equipment, comparing the waveforms and signal strengths, each reading a piece of a larger, intricate puzzle. The ambient noise of the front, a constant, harsh mix of distant artillery fire, and the closer, sharper reports of rifles sometimes threatened to overwhelm the delicate signals I was trying to decipher, making each deduction feel hard-won and precarious. I took great care with the sensitive equipment. I recalled the early days of telegraphy, how simple a connection was then, and compared it to this vast, tangled web stretching across a battlefield, a spider web designed to carry the very sinews of command. The enemy, I knew, was likely doing similar work, attempting to sow chaos through these unseen channels. And our ability to maintain clear communication was our advantage. A silent war fought with copper wire and ingenuity. This battle for signal clarity was as vital as any charge across no man's land. The particular nature of the interference suggested a resonance, a sympathetic vibration or feedback loop within the electrical current, and my attention was drawn to a stretch of cable laid near the remains of a shattered artillery emplacement, an area that had seen particularly brutal fighting. It was possible that the concussive force of explosions had subtly altered the electrical properties of the cable itself, or perhaps damaged a crucial insulator in a way that was not immediately visible to the naked eye, creating this troublesome echo. As I carefully approached the suspected area, the ground beneath my boots was still soft with recent rain, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled my nostrils, a contrast to the usual acrid odors of the front. I moved with practiced caution, scanning the ground for any sign of the cable, my eyes accustomed to picking out the subtle glint of metal or the dark line of insulated wire against the churned-up earth. Each step was deliberate, measured. Upon finding the cable, I saw no obvious break, no severed wire, but as I gently ran my fingers along its length, feeling for any unevenness, I detected a slight stiffness, a patch where the outer insulation felt unusually brittle. This was the telltale sign: prolonged exposure to dampness, perhaps exacerbated by chemicals in the soil, or even residual effects from nearby shelling, had degraded the material, creating a hidden weakness. The problem lay not in a break, but in a slow, insidious decay. My professional application involved meticulously stripping back a small section of the suspect insulation, exposing the copper wire beneath, and then using a specialized insulating compound and reinforcing tape, I carefully worked to create a new, more resilient sheath. This required a steady hand and a precise application of the materials, ensuring a clean, strong seal that would prevent any further ingress of moisture or electrical leakage. It was a task demanding both knowledge and patience. The moment of truth came as I reconnected the line and tested for continuity,
listening to the sharp, clear tone that indicated a solid connection, a world away from the distorted static that had plagued our messages earlier. The relief that washed over me was profound, a quiet exhalation of breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The successful repair meant our outgoing signals would once again carry their intended meaning, clear and precise. This task had changed how I saw the delicate nature of communication. The night promised little rest, only the grim necessity of work. My task was to lay a new communication line, a thicker, more robust cable than any we had used before, across the scarred expanse of no man's land. This lifeline was crucial for coordinating the major push planned for dawn. The weight of that responsibility pressed on me, a familiar pressure that had become almost a part of my own skin. Sergeant Davies, his face a roadmap of weariness etched by the constant strain, nodded curtly as he handed me the spool. We both understood the silence of the night was merely a brief pause in the storm, and that the real test would be performed under its returning fury. As we moved out, the ground underfoot was a treacherous mire, a thick, clinging mud that pulled at our boots with every step. The air, though clear of smoke for the moment, felt unervingly still, amplifying the distant, unsettling sounds of artillery. A sudden sharp crack nearby made me flinch, my hand instinctively reaching for the coil of wire. It was just a stray rifle shot, but the sound was a stark reminder of how exposed we were. Each forward movement was a conscious decision, a negotiation between my trained instincts and the primal urge to seek shelter. The flickering light of distant flares painted fleeting, ghastly images of shattered barbed wire and the twisted remains of what had once been men. My fingers, numb with cold and the persistent damp, worked by feel, tracing the faint outline of the trench system we had dug and defended. I remembered the feel of clean workbenches and the predictable hum of dynamos in my civilian life, a world away from this grasping, unforgiving earth. Here, my knowledge of how to string a wire, how to anchor it securely against wind and weather, was now a matter of life and death for hundreds. I could feel the rough texture of sandbags and the splintered wood of hastily constructed revetments as I guided the cable. It was a landscape sculpted by destruction, and I was tasked with weaving a thread of connection through its desolation. I began to unspool the new cable, a heavier gauge than our standard lines, designed to withstand the crushing weight of shell craters and the gnawing teeth of barbed wire. My training emphasized a steady hand, even when the ground itself seemed to tremble with the aftershocks of recent bombardments. I anchored the cable to a reinforced stake, ensuring a firm grip that wouldn't give way. My thoughts drifted to the principle of strain relief, how a single point of excessive tension could snap the entire length, rendering our efforts futile. It was a delicate dance, a balance between brute force needed to secure it and the precision required to keep it intact. The true challenge emerged as I reached a particularly devastated section, where a recent barrage had carved new, gaping holes in the earth. Visibility was almost nil beyond the immediate circle of my lantern's weak beam. The harsh mix of sounds, the guttural cough of machine guns from unseen positions, and the sporadic, chilling whistle of incoming shells created a tense symphony that played on my nerves. Each report of a gun, each whistle sent a jolt through me, a physical manifestation of the ever-present danger. I found myself pausing, listening intently, trying to discern the direction and proximity of each threat before daring to move again. It was in these moments, amidst the din and the darkness, that I recalled the debates among engineers back home about signal degradation over long distances. They discussed the properties of various insulating materials and the impact of ambient electrical fields. Here, those abstract scientific discussions transformed into practical, urgent realities. The integrity of this cable, its ability to carry clear messages, depended on my meticulous work, on my ability to avoid kinks, snags, and undue stress that could damage the delicate internal conductors. Even the slightest imperfection could mean a garbled order or a complete communication blackout. My mind wrestled with the potential consequences of failure. If this line went dead, the planned artillery adjustment wouldn't reach the forward batteries. Our own guns might fall silent, or worse, target our own advancing troops. The thought of my comrades being caught in friendly fire, their lives extinguished by a communication breakdown that I failed to prevent, was a heavy burden to bear. My own survival was tied intrinsically to the success of this task, but it was the lives of others that truly spurred me on, fueling a resolve born from a deep-seated sense of duty. I was a cog in a vast, brutal machine, but a vital one. A sudden, high-pitched whine, growing rapidly louder, cut through the night. Without conscious thought, I dropped, pulling the cable with me, shielding it with my body. The explosion was close, a violent eruption of earth and noise that shook me to my core. The stale biscuits I had eaten earlier suddenly felt like grit in my mouth, a dry, unwelcome taste. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the frantic chatter of our own machine guns opening up in response. The raw fear was a palpable thing, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. But the memory of Sergeant Davies' stern yet encouraging gaze pushed me to get back to work. Carefully, I tested the cable again, running my gloved hand along its length. It seemed intact, miraculously untouched by the blast. The resilience of this new material was impressive. It had absorbed the shock far better than our older lines. This reinforced cable, with its thicker rubber insulation and tougher outer sheathing, was a significant improvement. It represented not just better engineering, but a tangible effort to improve our chances, to give us a fighting edge against the relentless destructive forces we faced. This wasn't just stringing wire, it was an act of defiance against the chaos. The knowledge that soldiers like myself had painstakingly laid countless miles of these vital links, often under unimaginable conditions, filled me with a sense of shared purpose. It was a testament to the often unseen bravery of men who worked behind the front lines, ensuring the flow of information that dictated the success or failure of entire offensives. The historian in me noted how these seemingly mundane tasks were the true sinews of war, enabling coordinated action on a scale previously unimaginable. The debates raged even now about the true impact of technology versus sheer grit on the battlefield. But for us, they were inextricably linked. As I worked to secure the final anchor point, the distant rumble of artillery seemed to coalesce into a more unified sound, a growing crescendo that suggested the planned offensive was imminent. The ground began to vibrate subtly, a prelude to the storm. I checked the connections one last time, ensuring the metal conductors were firmly seated and well insulated. My confidence in the splice was bolstered by the memory of a peculiar detail I'd learned: the surprising effectiveness of certain natural resins, akin to those found in pine trees, in creating a durable, waterproof seal for electrical connections, a technique sometimes employed by sappers when modern materials ran short. The experience of laying this cable under fire, in the face of overwhelming darkness and constant threat, was a profound test. The psychological toll of the war had been immense, a relentless erosion of peace of mind. Yet, by successfully completing this critical mission, by ensuring that vital communication would flow at dawn, I felt a surge of quiet pride. It was a stark reminder that even in the depths of despair, individual action, guided by skill and determination, could make a tangible difference. This was more than just a job. It was a testament to my own resilience, a quiet victory in a landscape dominated by defeat. I carried this sense of accomplishment with me as I made my way back towards the relative safety of our lines. The first hint of dawn was a pale, sickly gray, bleeding into the inky blackness of the sky, a stark contrast to the velvet dark that had cloaked no man's land. The air, though still carrying the sharp tang of cordite, held a damp, earthy scent from the night's mist clinging to the churned earth, a smell I knew intimately, the smell of our world now, a world of mud and wire, and the constant, low thrum of anticipation. My muscles ached, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had become my constant companion, a physical manifestation of the relentless pressure I lived under. The new line, the one I'd painstakingly laid across that desolate stretch of earth through a symphony of explosions and the hiss of unseen bullets, felt like a fragile thread holding our entire sector together, a responsibility I carried with every fiber of my being. I'd secured its joins with extra care, double-checked its tension, and whispered a silent prayer that it would hold, that my efforts would prove sufficient against the overwhelming forces arrayed against us. The objective was clear, a critical piece of the day's plan to connect our forward artillery observation posts with the main batteries, ensuring precise targeting for the dawn offensive, a complex dance of destruction that relied on split-second timing and accurate intelligence. Sergeant Davies had clasped my shoulder before I'd set out, his eyes conveying a weight of understanding that needed no words, a shared recognition of our precarious situation. "Keep the channels open, Thomas," he'd said, his voice raspy, a gravelly sound that always carried a note of quiet authority. "That's your fight." And it was. My fight wasn't with a rifle or bayonet, but with the integrity of copper and insulation, a battle fought in the quiet, relentless hum of electricity that pulsed through the wires. The offensive was meant to start with a rolling barrage, a thunderous curtain of fire designed to soften the enemy's defenses, a signal that the day's main engagement had begun.
But as the prearranged moment arrived, only a few desultory booms echoed in the distance, a weak and uncertain start. Then an eerie silence descended, not the usual lull between barrages, but a profound, unsettling absence of the expected thunder, a void that prickled the back of my neck with unease. My heart sank, a cold dread pooling in my stomach as I processed this deviation from the meticulously planned assault. I scrambled from the relative shelter of our dugout, the cold mud sucking at my boots with a greedy sucking sound, and made my way to the primary junction box, the central hub of our immediate communication network. The connections I'd made with such precision just hours before were still intact, a small flicker of hope igniting within me as I saw no obvious damage. Perhaps it was a delay, a miscommunication further up the chain, a minor hiccup in the vast, complex machinery of war. But as I waited, scanning the horizon and listening intently, the silence persisted, broken only by sporadic enemy rifle fire and the unnerving whistle of a few isolated shells that fell far short of their intended targets, doing little damage but amplifying the sense of disarray. Then came the shouts from further up the line, cries of confusion and growing panic, a human wave of distress that signaled the true gravity of our situation. The enemy, sensing our disarray and the lack of our anticipated bombardment, began to respond with their own artillery, now landing with increasing accuracy on our positions, a direct reaction to our exposed vulnerability. "It's the line, Thomas." Sergeant Davies' voice, strained with urgency, cut through the growing din of the sporadic enemy fire and the confused shouts. "No reports coming through, nothing from the observers. We're blind." His words hit me like a physical blow, the sudden confirmation of my worst fears. My gut twisted, a sickening lurch that mirrored the feeling of a wire snapping under immense tension. Blind. That's what we would be, left exposed and vulnerable. Our carefully orchestrated ballet of destruction, reliant on split-second timing and accurate intelligence, was collapsing because of my wire. The thought was a physical blow, colder than the morning mist that clung to the ravaged earth. The weight of responsibility, which had felt manageable in the planning and execution phases of laying the new cable, now crushed me with its full, unyielding force. I had to get to the fault, to understand what had happened and to rectify it. The new line, the one I had personally guaranteed would hold, was my domain, my responsibility. This wasn't just about a broken wire. It was about the lives of every man in our company, perhaps even the entire battalion, depending on the success of this thrust. A terrifying realization that settled deep into my bones. I grabbed my tools, wire cutters, splicers, a fresh roll of insulating tape, and my portable testing galvanometer, each item feeling impossibly heavy, imbued with the gravity of the situation. The route I had taken just hours before, under the cloak of darkness and relative quiet, now felt like an exposed gauntlet, a perilous journey through an active battlefield. The enemy, alerted by our silence and the faltering start to our attack, was becoming bolder, their artillery fire no longer sporadic, but a sustained, punishing assault. I moved from trench to trench, my movements dictated by a desperate urgency. each explosion a jarring reminder of the fragility of my mission and the ever-present danger. The sounds were overwhelming, the concussive roar of shells impacting the earth, the splintering of wood from shattered dugouts, the sharp staccato bursts of machine gun fire that stitched across the landscape, and the rising tide of human shouts and cries of pain and fear. Smoke, acrid and stinging, burned my throat even through the respirator I wore, a constant reminder of the toxic atmosphere we inhabited. Reaching the forwardmost trench, the point from which the line had been laid into no man's land, I saw the devastation firsthand. The trench itself was a ruin, its earthen walls gouged and collapsed by recent shell impacts, a testament to the sheer ferocity of the bombardment. And there, a few yards out into the churned earth of the battlefield, was the evidence of the failure, a stark and brutal visual confirmation. The heavy, reinforced cable I had so carefully secured, the lifeline I had placed my trust in, was severed, not by a clean break, but mangled, a testament to the sheer brute force of a direct artillery hit that had obliterated the section. A large, freshly formed crater dominated the landscape, and the cable lay half buried in the churned earth, its protective outer sheath torn away, exposing the raw components within. My stomach churned as I recognized the faint, coppery smell of ionized air that lingered around the impact point, a telltale sign of the intense heat generated by the explosion, a heat that had likely melted and fused the delicate internal conductors. My mind raced, sifting through the vast reservoir of knowledge I possessed, searching for a solution that could be implemented in this hellish landscape, a way to restore the vital connection. The reinforced cable had a robust core designed for durability, but the sheer concussive force and extreme heat of the direct hit had evidently been too much for even its advanced construction, compromising its integrity. The insulation, a special synthetic rubber compound, was melted and charred in places, a visual representation of the destructive power unleashed. The delicate copper conductors within were exposed and likely fused together in some sections, creating a short circuit, or perhaps completely vaporized, leaving an irreparable gap. My task was to restore continuity, to bridge this gap, and to do it quickly, before the situation deteriorated further. I knelt, my gloved hands carefully working at the edge of the crater, the ground still trembling faintly with the residual shock waves of the explosion. The enemy fire was intensifying, the bullets and shrapnel crisscrossing the desolate terrain with a deadly pattern. I needed to reach the nearest intact section of the cable, both before and after the break, to make a new splice, a complex operation that required navigating the dangerous open ground. That meant venturing further into the open, into the very heart of the bombardment, a prospect that made my blood run cold. Part of me screamed to retreat, to seek the relative safety of the trench's collapsing walls. But the faces of my fellow sappers, the knowledge of the lives depending on me, pushed that fear aside, forcing me forward. My professional training, the years of practice and theoretical understanding, told me that failure here was unthinkable, a consequence I could not bear. I crawled, then scuttled, moving low to the ground, using shattered timber and mounds of earth for cover, each movement a calculated risk. The air was alive with the sound of bullets ricocheting off metal and earth, a terrifying, constant ping that set my teeth on edge. I reached the cable beyond the crater's edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The insulation was intact. The conductors still held their shape, a sign of hope. I pulled out my testing galvanometer, a simple but vital piece of equipment, its brass terminals cool against my sweating fingers. Connecting its terminals to the cable, I watched the needle, my breath held tight in my lungs. It remained stubbornly still, a dead reading, no current flowing, no continuity. The break was absolute, a stark confirmation of the damage. The same procedure on the other side of the crater yielded the same disheartening result, confirming the complete severance of the line. I had to make a new connection, using the materials I carried, a limited supply that demanded careful, precise application. My insulating tape was strong, designed for battlefield conditions, but this was a high stress point, subjected to constant vibration and the potential for further impacts, requiring more than just a simple wrap. I needed to recreate the protective casing as best I could, a daunting task with the enemy's fire intensifying. I unspooled more of the reinforced cable, carefully cutting away the damaged section with my insulated wire cutters, a clean severance that prepared the way for the repair. Then I took out my wire splicers, tools designed to create a secure mechanical and electrical connection between two separate lengths of wire, a precise and delicate operation. The process required a steady hand, a skill I'd honed through countless hours of practice, now tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Each twist, each crimp had to be perfect, for even a small imperfection could render the entire repair useless, a failure I could not afford. I worked with a fierce concentration, blocking out the cacophony around me, focusing solely on the small, vital task in my hands, the fate of many resting on my meticulous work. Once the new conductors were joined, I began the crucial insulating process, a multi-layered approach to ensure maximum protection. I took the specially prepared tarred cloth, a dense, waterproof material that Sergeant Davies and I had experimented with back in training, its slightly rough texture providing a good grip. It was thicker and more resilient than standard insulating tape, impregnated with a special mixture of tar and wax to resist moisture and abrasion, a critical adaptation for the damp, corrosive environment of the trenches. I began wrapping the spliced section, overlapping each layer tightly, ensuring no gaps were left, building a substantial barrier. As I wrapped, I could feel the slight tremors of distant explosions, each one a potential undoing of my work, a reminder of the precariousness of my efforts. The enemy's shelling shifted, now concentrating fire on the areas where our offensive was meant to have begun, a strategic move to disrupt our advance. This meant our artillery, lacking the correct targeting data, was not providing the necessary counter-battery fire to suppress the enemy's guns, leaving our own forces exposed. Our forward observers, unable to relay their observations due to the severed line, were effectively silenced, their vital eyes on the battlefield rendered useless. I could hear the shouts from our own gun emplacements, confused and frustrated by the lack of direction, a sound that amplified my own sense of urgency. The offensive was faltering, turning into a dangerous, disorganized affair, with our men advancing without adequate support, a scenario I had desperately tried to prevent. The weight of that failure, the knowledge that my broken wire was directly contributing to this chaos, was almost unbearable, a crushing emotional burden. I reached for a thicker, more robust outer layer of protective canvas, wrapping it around the tarred cloth to provide additional mechanical protection against the elements and any minor impacts, securing it with stout twine, creating a watertight seal. My hands were raw, my uniform stained with mud and sweat, but the splice was complete, a tangible result of my efforts. Now came the real test, the moment of truth, the continuity check, the final verification of my work. With trembling fingers, I connected the galvanometer terminals to the newly repaired section of the cable, my gaze fixed on the needle. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. For a moment, nothing happened, the needle remaining still, my hope wavering. Then, with a faint tremor, the needle quivered and settled, indicating a steady flow of current. It was alive. The connection was made. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. A release of the immense tension that had been building. But there was no time to savor it, no moment to rest. I had to ensure the message could get through, and quickly, to capitalize on this restored connection. I signaled back to the nearest trench, a series of short, sharp whistles, my signal for line repaired, attempting contact. A call that carried the weight of urgency. Sergeant Davies, his face grim and streaked with mud, appeared at the trench parapet, his eyes meeting mine. He nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and grim determination, a silent acknowledgement of the critical nature of this moment. He knew what this meant, the implications of a restored line in this chaotic dawn. "Get the word to the forward observers," he bellowed, his voice rough but clear, cutting through the din of the renewed fighting. "Tell them we've got a line. Get them their fire correction." I stood, my body protesting with every movement, and began to pack my tools, the familiar weight of my equipment a comfort. The sounds of battle continued around me, a constant, unsettling backdrop. But a different kind of sound was starting to emerge. The rumble of our own artillery, a deeper, more resonant roar that began to drown out the enemy's shelling, a sound of defiance and renewed purpose. Our guns were firing, answering the call, and the offensive, though severely hampered, was being given a chance to recover. But the close brush with disaster, the visceral understanding of how easily all our efforts could be undone by a single devastating blow, had also left a mark, a subtle but significant shift within me.
The gnawing anxiety that had always lurked beneath the surface now had a sharper edge, a more acute awareness of my own fallibility. I had saved the line today, but the war was far from over, and the enemy, along with the unforgiving elements of this ravaged landscape, would undoubtedly find new ways to silence us, new challenges to overcome. The dawn had been shattered, its promise of a decisive advantage broken, but through my efforts, perhaps we could salvage something from the wreckage of the morning, a glimmer of hope in the pervasive darkness. My mission had taken an unexpected turn. The oppressive gray sky pressed down, a familiar cloak of gloom that seemed to amplify the damp, earthy smell of the churned earth. A fine, persistent drizzle had begun hours ago, turning no man's land into a treacherous, slick mire. My kit felt heavier than usual, not just from the tools of my trade, but from the crushing weight of responsibility. The reconnaissance reports spoke of a stalled offensive, our forward artillery observers rendered blind by severed lines, and now my task was to re-establish that vital connection. My expertise in electronics and signal integrity, once applied to the sterile environment of a laboratory, was now my only shield in this brutal reality. My journey began along the familiar trench line, a claustrophobic network of mud and splintered wood, before I cautiously ventured out into the desolate expanse separating our lines from the enemy's. The ground here was a grim testament to the recent fighting. Shattered trees lay like fallen giants, remnants of barbed wire snaked through the mud, and the chilling, indistinct shapes of fallen men lay half hidden in the mire. The silence was a fragile thing, easily broken by the distant, desultory chatter of machine guns and the occasional, unnerving whistle of a falling shell, each one a stark reminder of the constant, invisible threat. Shade became precious, not for its coolness, but for the meager concealment it offered from any watchful enemy eyes. As I drew nearer to the target, a small, ruined farmhouse that our forward observers were using as a precarious salient, I saw the telltale signs of recent fierce fighting. Freshly dug trenches scarred the landscape, hastily emplaced machine gun nests were visible, and the stark, unmistakable scent of burning oil hung in the damp air. It was clear that our own signal teams had attempted to reach the farmhouse earlier, a fact confirmed by the discarded, mangled remnants of their cable near the ruined gateway, a tragic monument to their efforts. I knelt to examine the severed ends, my trained eye scanning for any clue. The insulation on their cable was not simply broken, it was fused in a peculiar glassy manner, a far cry from the clean cuts of shell fragments or the crushing force of a direct hit. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach as I realized this was not typical battle damage. My mind immediately cast back to my training sessions on signal integrity, where we had discussed the theoretical applications of electronic warfare and the potential for enemy devices to disrupt communications. I carefully tested the severed cable with my portable galvanometer, a sensitive instrument used to detect the flow of electrical current. The needle remained stubbornly dead, indicating a complete circuit failure. But as I examined the fused insulation more closely, I noticed a faint, almost iridescent sheen, a detail easily overlooked by an untrained eye.
This unusual fusion, coupled with the complete loss of signal, began to coalesce into a disturbing theory. Sergeant Davies had mentioned recent reports of improving enemy electronic warfare capabilities, whispers of new devices designed to disrupt our communications. The subtle, high-pitched whine that reached my ears as I drew closer to the farmhouse, a sound barely perceptible above the ambient battlefield noise, solidified my suspicion. It seemed to emanate from the vicinity of the ruined structure itself, a subtle hum that felt decidedly unnatural, an artificial disruption in the natural sounds of war. Pulling out a small, sensitive radio receiver, a piece of equipment I usually reserved for diagnostic purposes, I began to sweep the immediate area. To my surprise, as I brought it closer to the farmhouse, it began to crackle, picking up a powerful, albeit distorted, signal. This was not a standard enemy radio transmission. It was a broad-spectrum, high-frequency emission, the kind that could easily overwhelm and overload the sensitive electronics of our communication equipment, potentially even frying the delicate internal circuitry. The fused insulation on the severed cable now made terrifying sense. The enemy had deployed a localized jamming device, a tower of sorts, hidden somewhere within the farmhouse's ruins, specifically designed to fry any electronic signals that came too close, effectively rendering our communications impotent. This was a problem far more complex than a simple broken wire. This revelation significantly complicated my mission. My primary objective was to get a working line to the observers, but this jamming device presented a formidable obstacle. Simply running a standard cable near it would likely result in its destruction, just as the previous attempts had. My mind raced, sifting through my knowledge of signal propagation and electromagnetic interference. I remembered our discussions on shielded cables in training, how a Faraday cage-like construction could block such interference by reflecting or absorbing electromagnetic waves. However, we only had a limited supply of the specialized shielded cable, a superior but unwieldy product, and it would be a slow, painstaking process to lay it effectively under these conditions. I sat back on my heels, the cold seeping through my trousers, and contemplated the stark reality of my situation. The enemy would undoubtedly be monitoring our attempts to re-establish contact, and if they detected my activities, they might reinforce their jamming efforts or even dispatch patrols to intercept me. The light was fading rapidly, and with it, my window of opportunity for reconnaissance and repair was closing. My personal stakes were immense. If I failed to restore communications, our artillery would remain blind, and any further offensive action would be a suicidal gamble, likely resulting in heavy casualties for our stalled forces. Moreover, the observers themselves were likely low on supplies and ammunition, their survival dependent on our ability to support them. My mind wrestled with the immediate options. I could attempt to bypass the jamming field entirely, taking a much longer, more circuitous route through the treacherous and exposed terrain. However, the fading light would make navigation incredibly difficult, and the risk of detection or encountering enemy patrols on such a route was significant. Alternatively, I could attempt to physically disable the jamming device itself, but that would require venturing directly into the farmhouse ruins, a potentially lethal undertaking given the unknown enemy strength lurking within. The most plausible, though still challenging, approach seemed to be using the limited shielded cable I possessed to create a protected conduit for the main communication line, essentially constructing a miniature Faraday cage for our vital link.
I made my decision. The risk of trying to bypass the field or attacking the jamming device directly seemed too high, too uncertain, given the rapidly deteriorating light and the potential for unknown enemy strength. My expertise lay in understanding and maintaining the integrity of communication lines, not in direct combat. Therefore, I would attempt to build a shielded pathway for the signal. Carefully, I unspooled a significant length of the specialized shielded cable, its outer braided copper mesh a stark contrast to the simpler wires we typically used. This design was intended to absorb and dissipate electromagnetic interference, a superior product but considerably heavier and more difficult to handle in the field. My plan was to run this shielded cable as close to the farmhouse as possible, directly to the observer's position, connecting it to their remaining functional equipment, though I was acutely aware that even this cable had its limits against such a potent source. The journey to the farmhouse itself was a grueling test of endurance. The ground was uneven, riddled with shell craters and tangled remnants of barbed wire. Each foot of progress felt like a victory won against the treacherous terrain and the invisible threat of the jamming field. As I worked, I kept the radio receiver close at hand, constantly monitoring the jamming signal. It remained a constant, high-pitched, relentless drone that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. And as I got closer to the farmhouse, I could feel a subtle pressure, a disorienting sensation, the palpable effect of the jamming field. The scent of blooming jasmine, a faint sweetness that sometimes cut through the pervasive battlefield stench, was entirely absent today, replaced only by the perpetual, unpleasant odors of war. As I drew nearer to the farmhouse, the jamming signal intensified dramatically. The radio receiver, instead of crackling with static, began to emit a distorted, screeching tone, an alarming indication that even its sensitive components were being overwhelmed by the powerful emission. This was not good news. It suggested the jamming field was more potent than I had initially anticipated, capable of affecting even the most robust, well-shielded equipment. My own specialized shielded cable was designed to offer protection, but it was not infallible, especially against such a concentrated and powerful source. I reached the outer perimeter of the farmhouse's ruined defenses, a desolate landscape of rubble and shattered brick. The air here felt strangely charged, and the persistent hum seemed to vibrate in my very bones, a physical manifestation of the electronic disruption. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing, amplified through my respirator, each inhale a conscious effort against the palpable unease that gripped me. Through a gap in the debris, I spotted the distinct remnants of what looked like a small makeshift tower constructed from scavenged metal and electrical components, cleverly nestled within the deepest part of the farmhouse ruins.
This, I realized with a sinking feeling, was the source of the interference, and it was still very much active. My mission now became intensely focused, to connect the shielded cable to the observer's position inside the farmhouse. I moved cautiously towards a partially collapsed window, the only apparent entry point that hadn't been completely blocked by fallen rubble. The sharp crackle of enemy rifle fire from further down the line served as a stark reminder that I was not alone in this desolate, exposed landscape. I had to complete my task before total darkness descended, and before any enemy patrols could detect my activities and move to intercept me. My technical expertise was my weapon, and the delicate dance of wire and insulation my battlefield. Inside the farmhouse, the scene was one of desperate survival. Two of our forward observers, their uniforms torn and smeared with grime, huddled behind a makeshift barricade of fallen timbers, their faces etched with exhaustion. A flicker of hope ignited in their hollow eyes as they saw me, the reel of specialized cable clutched in my hand. "Thank God," one of them rasped, his voice hoarse with thirst and fatigue. "We thought we were cut off for good." I pointed towards the ruins outside, my voice low and urgent. "The jamming device," I explained. "It's frying anything that comes near." They nodded grimly, confirming my observations. "We saw the cable melt," the other observer added. "We tried to run another line, but it just went dead before it even got close." I carefully unspooled the end of the shielded cable, the braided copper mesh, a tangible symbol of our advanced technology against the enemy's crude but effective interference. My task now was to make the crucial connection, ensuring the integrity of the signal. The observers had miraculously managed to keep their field telephone equipment operational, but the incoming signal was being drowned out by the pervasive jamming interference. I found a length of discarded metal pipe, still relatively intact, and drove it firmly into the earth outside the farmhouse, securing the end of the braided shielding to it with insulating tape and a length of wire. This crude but effective grounding created a path for the electromagnetic interference to dissipate safely into the ground, hopefully preventing it from reaching the inner conductors of my cable, a critical step in creating an effective Faraday cage for our vital communication line. Then came the delicate, nerve-wracking part, connecting the inner conductors of my shielded cable to the field telephone. The jamming signal was still a palpable presence, a low thrum that seemed to permeate the very air. And as I began to make the connections, I noticed a faint, flickering distortion around the wires of the field telephone itself. The jamming was indeed powerful, and my shielded cable was only partially mitigating its effect, a fact that filled me with a fresh wave of apprehension. I took out my signal booster, a device designed to amplify weak incoming signals, a device that represented a significant gamble. If its delicate internal electronics were overwhelmed by the jamming, it would be utterly useless. I connected it between the incoming cable and the telephone, hoping the shielding would be enough to protect its sensitive components. The moment of truth had arrived. I flipped the switch on the booster. A wave of static washed over me, and the farmhouse seemed to vibrate with the sheer intensity of the interference. For a heart-stopping moment, I saw the needle on the galvanometer,
which I had connected to monitor the signal strength, waver erratically, then settle on a reading that was barely discernible, incredibly weak and distorted, almost lost in the overwhelming noise of the jamming signal. "Can you hear anything?" I asked the observers, my voice tight with anxiety. They were both leaning intently towards the telephone handset, their faces a picture of strained concentration. One of them, the one with the sergeant's stripes on his collar, slowly shook his head, a sign of disappointment. Then, a subtle movement. He held up a hand, signaling for absolute silence. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the remaining static. There's something there. It's faint, broken, but I think I can hear them." He spoke into the handset, his words carefully modulated, attempting to cut through the residual static and the persistent interference. I watched, my breath held captive in my chest, as he painstakingly worked to clarify the barely audible responses, a testament to his exceptional training and his ability to extract vital meaning from overwhelming noise. Slowly, painstakingly, a conversation began to form, the observers relaying crucial fire correction data, essential adjustments for our artillery to target enemy strongpoints more effectively and with greater precision. But my task was not yet finished. The connection remained incredibly precarious, the signal incredibly fragile. As they spoke, I noticed the jamming device outside seemed to pulse, its low hum fluctuating rhythmically, as if it were actively trying to counter our re-established signal and drown it out once more. I had to reinforce the connection to ensure it held firm against this electronic assault. I quickly applied more insulating tape, securing every joint, and carefully adjusted the grounding of the braided shielding, trying to maximize its protective effect against the relentless interference. Just as the observer relayed a crucial piece of targeting information, a critical adjustment that could turn the tide of battle, the distinct sound of approaching engine noise reached us from outside, accompanied by the sharp crackle of machine gun fire. Enemy patrols. They had detected our attempt to re-establish communications and were closing in to silence us. My work, so vital and so painstakingly completed, had drawn their attention directly. "They're coming!" shouted one of the observers, peering through a gap in the barricade, his voice strained. "We have to hold them off!" My heart pounded. My role was to maintain the lines, not to engage in direct combat. However, here, in this ruined farmhouse, cut off and exposed, the distinction blurred into a desperate necessity. I looked at the precious, fragile connection I had forged, the vital link to our artillery, knowing that if it was broken again, all hope would be lost. I had to protect it, and by extension, protect the men who relied on it. The enemy would undoubtedly be trying to silence us, and my shielded cable, my painstakingly crafted connection, was now the prize they sought to destroy. The fading light and the encroaching enemy patrols added a new, desperate urgency to my already perilous mission. The battle for the airwaves, for the very flow of information that dictated survival on this battlefield, had just begun. The implications of what I'd found would unfold in time. The oppressive hum of the enemy's jamming device seemed to seep into my very bones, a constant, disorienting pressure that had intensified since my clumsy attempt to reinforce the incoming line. The makeshift barrier of enemy cable wrapped around my own shielded conduit had provided a fragile buffer, but it was clearly insufficient against the focused intensity of their equipment, likely hidden deeper within the farmhouse's collapsing structure. Sergeant Miller, his face a mask of grim determination, was still hunched over the field telephone, his voice a low, strained murmur as he tried to relay fragmented targeting data to our artillery. The connection was barely a whisper against the roaring static, a testament to the fragile nature of our hold on this communication relay. The recent discovery that the enemy had actively developed and deployed such devices, capable of disabling our vital signals with focused electromagnetic energy, was a chilling revelation. Just as Miller managed to get a clear sentence through, a violent tremor shook the farmhouse, followed by the deafening roar of an artillery shell impacting perilously close. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the already precarious stability of the ruined structure seemed to diminish further. The immediate concern shifted from the jamming device to the physical integrity of our position. The enemy, aware of our presence and our efforts to maintain communication, was clearly attempting to dislodge us with concentrated fire. My own role as a sapper, typically focused on the meticulous work of laying and repairing wires, now felt terrifyingly inadequate against the sheer brute force of artillery. The need to reinforce not just the electrical integrity of the line, but the physical security of our position weighed heavily. A new, more immediate threat presented itself. The enemy machine gun fire, which had been sporadic earlier, now seemed to converge on our position with alarming precision. Sergeant Miller, ducking instinctively as a burst of fire splintered the makeshift barricade, yelled, "They're zeroing in on us, Thomas. They know we're here." My attention snapped to the incoming cable, the very lifeline I had worked so desperately to keep intact. The torn shielding, my previous failure to create a robust barrier, meant that the jamming field was now directly impacting the inner conductors, and the fragile signal was flickering in and out of existence. The enemy was clearly aware of our success in re-establishing a weak connection, and their immediate objective would be to sever it completely. My mind raced, desperately searching for a solution to this immediate physical threat to the cable itself. The enemy's objective was to silence us, and their current method was clearly effective bombardment. If they could reach the cable's entry point, they could easily sever it with their rifles or bayonets, rendering my efforts and the observer's dangerous relay completely useless. The concept of using the cable's own conductive properties, which had been so crucial in my earlier attempts to mitigate the jamming, now presented a new, more desperate defensive application. I needed to create a physical barrier, something more substantial than my earlier makeshift wraps that could withstand direct enemy assault. Looking around the ruined farmhouse, my gaze fell upon a sturdy metal desk that had been overturned during the shelling. Its legs twisted, but its frame largely intact.
It was heavy, unwieldy, but it possessed a degree of structural integrity that my previous efforts lacked. The idea, wild and perhaps reckless, began to form. If I could position this desk directly over the point where the cable entered the farmhouse, using it as a shield, it might provide enough protection to prevent the enemy from severing the line directly. This would be a physical defense using available materials, but it was born from my understanding of how to protect conductive materials from external interference.
"Sergeant," I called out, my voice tight with a newfound urgency, "I need your help to move that desk. We can use it to cover the cable entry." Miller, his attention divided between the phone and the encroaching enemy fire, nodded grimly. "Corporal, cover us," he barked, gesturing towards the small opening in the barricade where the corporal was firing his rifle. The corporal, a young man with sweat beading on his brow, acknowledged the order with a curt nod, his rifle barking a response to the enemy's increasingly close gunfire. The combination of the persistent, high-frequency hum from the jamming device and the sharp crackle of small arms fire created a disorienting symphony of danger. Moving the desk was a Herculean task. Its weight was immense, and the floor was littered with debris, making every inch of progress a struggle. The enemy's fire intensified, bullets pinging off the desk's metal surface and kicking up sparks. Each clang was a jarring reminder of the proximity of the enemy and the stakes involved in my unconventional defense. The strain of lifting and dragging the heavy metal was immense, and my muscles screamed in protest. Despite the physical exertion, my mind remained focused on the objective: protecting the cable, preserving the last vescom of communication. My understanding of its conductive nature, its vulnerability, drove my every effort.
As we maneuvered the desk into position, I noticed a critical flaw in my earlier improvisation. The enemy's cable, used to create makeshift insulation, was not securely anchored to my own shielded conduit. This meant that any significant physical disturbance, like the movement of the desk, could easily dislodge the connection, breaking the fragile circuit. The very act of trying to protect the cable was now threatening to disrupt it further. This realization added a layer of intense pressure to my already desperate task. My expertise in this moment was being tested not just by the enemy's actions, but by my own oversights. With renewed urgency, I had to quickly secure the connection before we could fully position the desk. Sergeant Miller, seeing my struggle, shifted his aim slightly, providing a brief concentrated burst of covering fire towards the farmhouse's outer wall where the enemy was attempting to breach. This gave me a precious few moments. I grabbed my insulated pliers and a length of wire I had scavenged, quickly reinforcing the anchor point where my shielded cable connected to the observer's field telephone. The braided copper shielding was still secured to the grounding pipe outside, a crucial link to dissipating the jamming frequencies. But the internal connection to the phone was now more precarious. We managed to heave the desk into place, its heavy bulk settling over the entry point of the cable, providing a substantial physical shield. The immediate threat of direct severance seemed averted, at least for the moment. However, the compromised shielding and the jury-rigged insulation meant the jamming interference was likely to be even worse now. Sergeant Miller, peering through a small gap in the barricade, reported, "They're trying to flank us, coming round the south side." The enemy was relentless, adapting their approach, forcing me to constantly reevaluate the situation and my available resources. The physical act of moving the desk, so critical for protecting the cable, had unfortunately aggravated the integrity of the connection I had so painstakingly created. The temporary insulation made from the enemy's damaged cable was now awkwardly positioned, partially dislodged by the shifting weight of the desk. This meant the jamming waves, no longer adequately buffered, were now seeping directly into the inner conductors of my shielded cable, threatening to drown out the precious signal entirely. The hum, which had slightly receded, now seemed to surge back with renewed intensity, a physical throb that reverberated through the floor. I had to work quickly to stabilize the insulation, to re-establish a more effective buffer. This required reaching directly to the connection point, a delicate maneuver performed under the cover of the desk, but still dangerously close to the path of enemy fire. My understanding of how conductive materials interacted with electromagnetic fields was paramount here. The enemy's damaged cable, with its fused insulation, acted as a crude but potentially effective insulator against the specific jamming frequencies. My task was to reposition and secure it, ensuring a more complete seal. With Sergeant Miller providing a furious barrage of covering fire, I squeezed myself into the cramped space between the barricade and the newly positioned desk. The heat from the nearby telephone equipment, now working at full capacity to broadcast the vital targeting data, was palpable. I carefully adjusted the pieces of enemy cable, trying to create a more uniform layer of insulation around the exposed connection. My insulated pliers were essential, allowing me to manipulate the conductive materials without becoming part of the circuit myself, a vital safety precaution when dealing with such intense interference. As I worked, I noticed a faint crackling sound, different from the ambient static, emanating from within the farmhouse's walls. It wasn't the enemy's jamming signal, but a series of sharp, rhythmic pulses. The observers had mentioned that their field telephone was also equipped with a rudimentary Morse code signaling capability, a backup for when voice communication became impossible. Sergeant Miller, hearing my frantic adjustments, shouted, "Thomas, I think they're trying to transmit by code. The jamming is too bad for voice." My task had just become even more critical. I had to ensure that even these faint, pulsed signals could get through the interference and reach our artillery. The subtle shift in the jamming intensity, coupled with the fragmented nature of the signal, led me to a new insight. My earlier assumption about the enemy's jamming device being solely concentrated in one location might have been too simplistic. It was possible that the interference wasn't a single static field, but perhaps something more dynamic, or even a network of smaller devices. This new understanding of the enemy's capabilities, a direct result of observing their active responses to my attempts to counter them, was unsettling but invaluable. It meant that my current methods of defense might need constant adaptation. The final act of securing the makeshift insulation was a race against time. The sounds of the enemy were now alarmingly close, their shouts and the clatter of their equipment audible just beyond the barricade.
Sergeant Miller and the corporal were firing with desperate precision, holding them at bay. I pushed the last piece of enemy cable into place, securing it tightly with tape, creating as complete a seal as I could manage. The signal, while still weak, seemed to stabilize slightly, the rhythmic pulsing becoming more distinct through the receding static. My understanding of how to protect communication lines, particularly against this new threat of electromagnetic interference, had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. The fragile connection I'd managed to forge, a delicate thread of whispers against the enemy's electronic roar, had held for precious minutes. Sergeant Miller's focused relaying of targeting data had allowed our artillery to land crucial shells, softening a particularly stubborn enemy emplacement that had been pinning our advance. However, this renewed effectiveness had apparently not gone unnoticed. A fierce counterattack, driven by concentrated machine gun fire and an alarming number of enemy troops, was now surging towards our position in the ruined farmhouse, aiming to silence the source of this newfound artillery support, the equipment I had worked so desperately to keep operational. The air, still damp from the persistent drizzle, now carried the acrid stench of burning oil and the unmistakable scent of freshly discharged ammunition.
The sudden, brutal shift in the battle caught us by surprise. The focused shelling that had been hammering enemy positions had ceased, replaced by the terrifyingly close rat-tat-tat of automatic weapons and the heavy thud of grenades impacting the farmhouse's crumbling walls. Sergeant Miller, his face etched with a mixture of relief and renewed tension, shouted instructions into the telephone, attempting to relay the dire situation to our own lines. The corporal, his rifle spitting controlled bursts, fired through a shattered window at the encroaching figures. My own focus, however, was drawn to the fragile network of wires and equipment that had become my sole responsibility, and the enemy's determined efforts to disrupt it. As the enemy's assault intensified, fragments of plaster and brick rained down around us, kicked up by nearby explosions. A grenade detonated just outside the window where I had anchored my shielded cable, and the entire structure seemed to shudder. The humming of the enemy's jamming device, which had been a constant, irritating presence, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and I could feel a strange warmth emanating from the cable's connection point. This was more than just simple interference. The physical proximity of the enemy's attack was somehow amplifying the jamming field. Or perhaps the blast had directly affected the enemy's device in a way that changed its output. The enemy's objective was clear: neutralize our communication and the source of our artillery support. I saw a determined enemy soldier, his face grim beneath his helmet, attempting to scramble through a breach in the outer wall, directly towards the area where my shielded cable was anchored. My improvised solution, the makeshift insulation using the damaged enemy cable, was proving inadequate against this direct, aggressive assault. The carefully constructed barrier was now under direct physical attack, and my primary task of maintaining the signal was becoming inextricably linked with defending the physical integrity of the equipment itself. My mind raced, sifting through the limited resources at hand. My tools, designed for delicate manipulation, were inadequate for direct combat. However, I had the salvaged enemy cable, its fused insulation a mystery,
and the knowledge of the jamming device's location, somewhere deeper within the farmhouse's ruins. The immediate threat was to the incoming communication line, but the ultimate solution lay in disrupting the source of the interference itself. This meant a perilous venture outside the relative, albeit temporary, safety of our barricaded position.
Sergeant Miller, his eyes flicking between the telephone and the encroaching enemy, recognized the dilemma. "Thomas, that cable is our lifeline. We can't let them cut it," he yelled over the din. "But they're coming straight for it." I understood the gravity of the situation. The enemy's assault wasn't just an attempt to overwhelm our position. It was a targeted effort to sever our vital connection. My own expertise, which had focused on the passive maintenance of circuits and signals, was now being tested by the active, aggressive measures of the enemy. The delicate balance I had struck with my improvised shielding was clearly about to be broken by brute force. I knew then that my role had to expand, to encompass not just repair, but also active defense, and perhaps even neutralization of the threat at its source. My gaze swept across the ruined farmhouse interior, searching for any advantage. I spotted a length of discarded iron piping, part of the building's original plumbing, leaning against a wall near the main entrance. It was heavy, solid, and could serve as a makeshift club. More importantly, I remembered the precise nature of the enemy's jamming device. It emitted electromagnetic waves. While my shielded cable was designed to block these, I had also observed how the sheer proximity to the enemy's device could amplify the interference. This suggested a localized intensity. What if the source itself could be disrupted, not by destroying it, but by altering its environment, perhaps by short-circuiting its output through a direct, unintended ground connection? A daring, potentially reckless idea began to form. The enemy soldier, attempting to breach the outer wall, was moving towards the cable's connection point. If I could get to the source of the jamming device and use the conductivity of the metal piping to create a sudden, massive grounding path, perhaps I could overload or disrupt the device itself, even if only temporarily. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble born of necessity, but the alternative, allowing the enemy to sever our lifeline, was unthinkable. The idea of using common plumbing to fight an electronic battle was certainly an unusual turn of events, a far cry from the pristine laboratories of my training. Sergeant Miller saw the determined glint in my eyes. "What are you thinking, Thomas?" he barked, firing another burst towards the advancing enemy. "I have an idea, Sergeant," I replied, my voice tight with focus, "about the jamming device. I need to try something." Before he could protest, I moved. Clutching the iron pipe, I slipped out of our barricaded position through a less compromised opening, using the smoke and chaos of the fighting as cover. The enemy soldier who had been heading for the cable was now engaged with Corporal Davies at the window. I moved low and fast, hugging the ruined walls, the infernal humming of the jamming field intensifying with every step. The damp earth seemed to absorb the sound, yet I could feel its vibration in my bones.
The scent of burning oil was stronger here, mingled with the distinct smell of ozone, a telltale sign of electrical discharge. I located the enemy's makeshift jamming apparatus tucked away in a collapsed section of the farmhouse's cellar. It was a crude but effective assembly of wires, coils, and a small sputtering generator, emitting a powerful, invisible field. The enemy soldiers guarding it were engaged with my comrades inside. This was my chance. I sprinted forward, the heavy pipe held firmly in my hands. My objective was not to engage them directly, but to reach the heart of the device.
With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I jammed the end of the iron pipe into the earth directly beneath the main emitter coil of the jamming device. My training in electrical grounding kicked in. By creating a direct, low-resistance path to the earth, I was hoping to short-circuit the powerful electromagnetic field the device was generating. I could feel the pipe violently as I made contact, and the humming of the jamming apparatus changed pitch, a sickening groan that suggested a severe overload. Sparks flew from the device, and the intense, disorienting pressure in my head suddenly eased, replaced by the sharp sting of static discharge that ran up the pipe into my hands, forcing me to drop it with a cry. The effect was immediate. The oppressive humming abruptly ceased, replaced by an almost startling silence, broken only by the sounds of the ongoing fight. The telephone in the farmhouse, moments before a torrent of static, now carried clear, sharp voices as Sergeant Miller continued his relay. Our artillery support, previously stifled, began to unleash a precise and devastating barrage upon the enemy's advancing ranks. I watched from my position, the abandoned iron pipe still humming faintly in the damp earth, as the enemy's counterattack, deprived of its electronic advantage and now facing accurate artillery fire, began to falter and break. The challenge had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. The hum of the enemy's jamming device, though no longer actively broadcasting its disruptive frequencies, still seemed to vibrate in the very dust of the shattered farmhouse. Sergeant Miller and his men, their faces etched with grime and exhaustion, were busy shoring up our defenses, their rifles still pointed at the broken entrances, a constant vigilance against any renewed enemy push. The communication line I had so painstakingly restored, my fragile triumph against the electronic assault, still emitted its faint, steady tone, a fragile thread of sound against the battlefield's din. Yet I knew this quiet was unlikely to last. My attention, however, had turned to the silent, formidable presence of the enemy's apparatus itself. The device, now exposed and seemingly inert, was a potent reminder of their technological prowess and its potential for hazardous electrical discharge, or even a secondary reactivation, was a burden I now carried. My knowledge, usually dedicated to the intricacies of copper wire and insulation, now demanded a different focus: the safe dismantling of unfamiliar, potentially volatile electrical components. I approached the contraption with a healthy dose of caution, the lingering scent of ozone and burnt oil a stark warning. It was a crude, yet undeniably effective assembly of repurposed batteries, thick wiring, and large coil-like structures that I understood were the broadcast elements.
The strange fused insulation I had encountered on the earlier severed cable, a direct result of this device's potent energy, now made terrifying sense. My primary concern was the battery array. A careless disconnection could trigger a surge, an uncontrolled discharge that might not only render our communication line inoperable, but also create a dangerous electrical arc capable of igniting the surrounding debris. My primary concern was the battery array. A careless disconnection could trigger a surge, an uncontrolled discharge that might not only render our communication line inoperable, but also create a dangerous electrical arc capable of igniting the surrounding debris. I retrieved my insulated tools, my trusty galvanometer, and a length of non-conductive cordage I had scavenged from the farmhouse's wreckage. My strategy was twofold. First, to carefully isolate the power source, and second, to systematically dismantle the broadcasting elements, ensuring no residual charge remained within them. This process demanded a delicate touch, a methodical approach, the kind of precision I had practiced countless times in more peaceful settings. Using my insulated pliers, I began to sever the main power conduits leading from the battery array to the broadcasting coils, maintaining a firm grip on the insulated handles throughout. As each connection was broken, I tested the terminals with my galvanometer, searching for any lingering voltage. Most read dead, but one section, connected to a particularly large capacitor, showed a faint but persistent charge, a clear indication of stored energy. Using my insulated pliers, I began to sever the main power conduits leading from the battery array to the broadcasting coils, maintaining a firm grip on the insulated handles throughout. As each connection was broken, I tested the terminals with my galvanometer, searching for any lingering voltage. Most read dead, but one section, connected to a particularly large capacitor, showed a faint but persistent charge, a clear indication of stored energy. This capacitor, I realized, was the most dangerous component. It was likely designed to store and release a powerful burst of energy, and its careless handling could have severe consequences. My mind immediately flashed back to a theoretical lesson on capacitors, on the critical importance of providing a safe, low-resistance path to ground for any stored electrical charge. I took the salvaged cordage, carefully stripping its insulation from both ends, and prepared to attach one end to the capacitor's terminal, ensuring a firm, secure connection. The other end I would need to ground. The damp earth outside, where I had already established a grounding point for our communication cable, seemed the most logical and safest place to direct any potential discharge. As I prepared to make this connection, Sergeant Miller's voice, tight with urgency, cut through the relative quiet. "Thomas, more of them coming from the west. They're pushing hard." The enemy, it seemed, had not given up their assault, and my task had suddenly become a race against time. A dangerous endeavor demanding the simultaneous dismantling of the jamming device while our defenses were tested once more. The faint, steady tone of the restored communication line was a constant, subtle reminder of what was at stake. A fragile thread of sound I was desperately trying to secure, even as I dismantled the very threat that had sought to silence it. My focus now shifted to the immediate safety of the capacitor and the overall stability of the communication link. The sergeant and his men were already bracing for the renewed enemy push, their rifles trained on the farmhouse's broken entrances, their vigilance a stark contrast to my own more technical, albeit equally critical, task. The complexity of the situation, with the lingering threat of the enemy's active assault and the volatile nature of the device, demanded a rapid yet precise sequence of actions. I moved with deliberate haste to connect the cordage to the capacitor's terminal, then crawled towards the broken window, aiming for the grounding pipe I had driven into the earth earlier. As I extended the cord, I could feel a subtle, almost imperceptible pull as the stored energy sought the path to ground. This was a process that required absolute concentration, a meticulous attention to detail honed through countless hours of practice, now amplified by the immediate threat of active combat. I needed to ensure the connection was firm, that the entire discharge process was controlled, minimizing any risk to the fragile communication line that remained our only link to artillery support. With the cord securely attached, I watched intently as the galvanometer's needle, previously showing a persistent charge, slowly began to waver and then settle back to zero. The capacitor was discharging. A small but significant victory, yet the larger task remained. I turned my attention to the broadcasting coils, the heart of the jamming apparatus. These were large metallic structures, and I needed to ensure no residual energy remained within them. I carefully used my insulated tools to pry them loose, examining each connection point and testing for any electrical anomalies. The enemy's ingenuity was clear, but their construction methods, while powerful, were often crude, leaving potential points of failure or unwanted energy storage. As I worked, the sounds of renewed fighting outside grew louder, closer. Shouts and the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the ruins, punctuated by the concussive thud of incoming shells that fell short but still rattled the very foundations of the farmhouse. Sergeant Miller's voice, strained but resolute, could be heard directing his men, their defensive positions clearly being tested. My own movements became more urgent. My focus split between the intricate task of dismantling the device and the immediate need for self-preservation. Each moment I spent here, exposed, was a risk, but the successful neutralization of this threat was paramount to our continued communication and, therefore, our survival on this part of the front. This encounter with the enemy's advanced yet volatile electronic warfare technology lingered in my thoughts as I worked to secure our fragile connection. As the curtain of night falls, let us gently close our chapter on the life of that British soldier in the WW1 trenches. Imagine the quiet after the day's trials, the low murmur of shared stories by flickering lamplight, a fragile peace in the midst of it all. He, too, would have sought solace in the dim light, dreaming of home as the damp earth settled around him. May your own sleep tonight be a peaceful one, free from the burdens of that era, carrying you softly into a new dawn. Rest now.